everybody. We are going to review a little bit of history before we get started. Thomas Jefferson has been elected in the 1800 as a very qualified but highly contended um, candidate, and he has a lot of stuff he wants to do domestically, and we've looked at that all week, seeing that he was trying to bring it back to what the Democratic Republicans believed as the ideal America. We have Marbury versus Madison judicial review, right? And that gives so the Supreme Court the power that they need to review laws passed by Congress. So they're going to have the last word. And the principles of government that are addressed here are checks and balances and separation of powers. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, was really smart, and he knew that the Supreme Court was going to need to grow in power to be equal to the executive branch and the legislative branch. And this was how he did it, was through Marbury versus Madison with the midnight judges. And poor Marbury, I never really got his appointment to judge. And remember that in the Marshall Court, they decided that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, and that they did not have the power to listen to this case. And so they pushed it back down to lower courts. And we're going to see that the Supreme Court becomes key. This also raises your power in the executive branch as well, because your president appoints Supreme Court justices for life. And so the Supreme Court justice will outlive a president, and that becomes a very key thing in what presidents can do. So we also talked about the Louisiana Purchase, because the Louisiana Purchase almost doubles the size of the United States. Napoleon needed money after the trying to take Haiti, literally went south, and he didn't get it back. And so Thomas Jefferson was confronted with his ambassadors, because they had $10 million to buy New Orleans, because we know New Orleans is a key port that allows everything that's going to be shipped down the Mississippi to go out to the Gulf and then around the world. And but when his ambassadors came back, they said, "Oh my gosh, we need $15 million because they're going to sell us all of the Louisiana territory." And Thomas Jefferson was conflicted, because my gosh, he wanted it and he was curious about it. He's got a very scientific mind, curious mind, and he wants to know what's out there. But at the same time, it doesn't tell him he can do that in the Constitution, because he's a strict constructionist. But he finally ends up coming okay with it, because he realizes it's what's best for our country. And so he sends Lewis and Clark out to explore. And you looked at their journals last week and what they took with them and how it went. And they learned a lot about that territory. With each land acquisition that we have this semester, you're going to see that questions about statehood, questions about slavery, questions about how those states are going to run and how they're going to be accepted into the United States are going to almost split this country apart. And then it's going to take a long time for us to heal from that. So now there's problems at sea, and Thomas Jefferson is having a hard time, because Britain and France are at war. Napoleon, again, we talked about this last week, how his idea, he was going to take over the whole world, and he had taken over almost all of Europe. So the problem is that both sides worry that America is going to fight for one or the other. And so they start passing laws trying to prevent American merchants from trading with Britain and France. So America's not doing this. The other countries are doing this. So they're like, you can't trade with us. Well, that's going to hurt us in the end in our economy. They also start seizing ships again, because they've been doing that forever, and impressing soldiers. So what is the impressment? This is, they say that they're looking for British sailors who have stowed away on American ships and are trying not to be in the British Navy anymore. And when they find them, then they're going to take them back to the British Navy. The problem is that most of the times they don't find them, and they just impress American soldiers or sailors. And so that is not fair, obviously, but at the same time, this is a huge problem. And so Jefferson doesn't really know what to do about this. One side wants to stop. They all want the impressment to stop, but some of them just also want to embargo. What an embargo is when you ban trade with a certain country. And so in 1807, with Thomas Jefferson's pushing, Congress passes the Embargo Act. Well, that is not good at all for anybody, because we've banned trading with all countries. So we'll only have domestic trade. Well, it's intended to hurt Britain and France, but who it really ends up hurting is the American merchants. American merchants can't do any business with anybody except for who's in the United States. Well, we need processed goods from the rest of the world, and they need raw materials from us. And you would think, kind of like with how Alexander Hamilton thought about uh, uh, how Alexander talked about taxing imported goods, tariffs. Goodness, couldn't think that. That this would work. Well, it did not work at all. Everybody was miserable. The businesses were failing. Jefferson's reputation goes down the tubes, and eventually it's replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act, which basically just bans trade with only Britain and France. So Thomas Jefferson, in the end, ends up really not wanting to run for president again. The other thing that is a huge problem is that the Native Americans in the Northwest Territory, which they thought the Treaty of Greenville would have fixed this, but of course it's not, because American settlers are just pushing the Indians out of their land. So the Native Americans unite behind Tecumseh, and he is supported by the British. And William Henry Harrison, who's the governor of Indiana, eventually attacks Tecumseh's forces, and the Native Americans are defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe. This all sounds good for the settlers out there, but it isn't good because they were backed by the British. And so in terms of foreign policy, it's not a great thing for Jefferson either. And so Jefferson's exhausted by the end of his 4 years. William Henry Harrison will become one of our next presidents. And then we're also going to talk a little bit more about Tecumseh as well, because of this idea of uniting against the American government and seeing if that works for the Native Americans. Once we track out everything with our timeline with the Native Americans, we're going to see that, both sides just couldn't cohabitate the way that the values were and the way that the two different cultures clashed. We're going to see that the white settler wanted land and wanted to expand and wanted to progress. Meanwhile, they're pushing Native Americans off their ancestral land. And so we're going to see a lot of different conflict and skirmishes and people dying on both sides. So we'll continue to track how the United States government deals with Native Americans. So today you are going to head into learning. You'll learn a little bit more about embargo and non-intercourse, but you will also be learning about our next. It's called the Second American War, Mr. Madison's war, because James Madison's going to be elected president. And at that point in time, everybody wants to go to war with the British. And so we were going to fight the War of 1812. And so you will do that in your mini-Q.